Thanks everybody for being here this afternoon. Breaking away from your other video conferences and work at home, I'm sure. The approach we're taking today, the title of the presentation is 5 tips to keep you from screwing up your fundraising. And I take this perspective because that's really kind of the approach of a lot of things. There's a way to do this right. Those who succeed are the ones who are going to put the most effort into it. But a lot of times the people who fail at this are the ones who left out key elements. They did not just have the appropriate, they didn't get up to the baseline. They didn't have what they had to have in place. And I can guarantee you that as we come out of the situation we're in with the markets the way they've been and people uncertain about their money and the economy, it's going to be more of a challenge to raise money over the next year or two. That doesn't mean it's not happening. It's happening every day. As an example of how things came to a real sudden halt, I was working on a transaction a month ago that it was Thursday. We were supposed to sign the deal on Friday, and everything just came to a sudden halt because the investors in the private equity company, all of a sudden, well, the market had gone down like 25% over that week. They were very nervous about where their money was and what they would have allocated to things. That's going to persist. At the same time, things are happening. If you follow things like Crunchbase and get the daily reports, there are large transactions happening. There's still seed money happening with good ideas. And this is still a time that you can be preparing and working, especially if you have an online venture. So let me figure out again. This is my second time after let's share the screen. Jump in here. Apologize, give me a second here. All right, hopefully you can see that. 5 tips to keep you from screwing up your fundraising. I love pithy quotes. I don't know who said this one. I know the managing partner at Edward Jones, when I was there years ago, put it on a trophy to give people in a similar fashion, but it's one I've always liked, and it really kind of sums up what I was just saying. You may not win the war with it, but you'll certainly lose without it. And that's really some of the approach here today is the keys here are you need to have certain, yeah.
So sorry, we're not able to see your slides. I don't know if you want to change the window possibly that it's sharing.
Let me see if I've got that here. Okay, hit the screen too. I'll go over this then instead. Can you see them?
Not yet.
Oh, here we go.
There we go.
Wrong button. Tech entrepreneur can't do tech. That was the demonstration of never going to a demonstration or a pitch and have to rely on technology. And that actually is a point I should include in here, but I don't. So the first thing, let's talk about what are some of the table stakes you've got to have before we even start to talk about funding. Mere ideas do not get funded. Products don't get funded. What gets funded are businesses. Are you developing a business? Are you ready to seek funds? Where do you need to be before you really are seeking money from any kinds of third parties? You need to at least have a prototype or an MVP, a minimum viable product in place. That'll sometimes depend on what you're developing. If you're putting out some kind of online marketplace that could be built in 2 or 3 months with a couple of people using existing web functionality, you're absolutely going to be expected to have something up and running and users. On the other hand, if you're in something that's really sophisticated like deep fintech or biotech, you may just have prototypes and experiments and studies because you may not even be able to go to market without $1 million. And some of that's going to depend on what you're, like I said, what you're doing and what your challenges are. So you need to have something in place that's real. You can't just have an idea. You need to show that there really are potential customers and contracts, not just market studies, but real potential customers. Potentially you're signing letters of intent. You need to have a team. Single founder companies are rarely funded. It doesn't mean they don't happen. It can happen, especially if somebody has experience, but there needs to be a team. Is kind of an example. You can't get into certain accelerators like Y Combinator unless you can demonstrate that the team itself can actually build and take the product to market. Revenue, question mark. You may or may not need revenue yet. Some companies get funded pre-revenue. Again, it's going to depend on the type of business that you're in. If you're selling something that could go to market fairly easy, revenue is what shows that you actually have the capability to have users and have a business. And I see this one a lot. Patents and trademarks. People think that once they have a patent or they have intellectual property protected, that they now have value. That's backwards. Patents and trademarks don't create value. They protect the value you created. There are millions, literally millions of patents on the book with the United States Patent and Trademark Office that produce no revenue or income. They're essentially worthless. They were patented. That doesn't mean they didn't lead to something else. Maybe they were a great idea, but the key of creating a patent or getting something recognized does not create a business. In the end, a business is, as Peter Drucker said, a business exists to create a customer. And you have to prove that you have a business that can create customers, and you are down that path before you can even start looking at raising money. This gives you a little insight into what that venture pathway is. Idea, team, you put together the company, you're bootstrapping to an MVP. Now, once you're at that stage, you might start looking for money. And these are some of the phases. Angels and seed kind of blend together. The angel, what do we mean when we say angels? Angels are people, generally people, directly, individuals, who are helping fund startups. They have an interest in it. They like the gamble, they like the excitement, they like contributing. Usually they made some money through risk. Maybe not always, but they appreciate and have an understanding of the business. While seed gets a little more substantial. It's a little more money. It's more likely to have an institution involved. But typically angels and seed phase are still convertible or very informal deals. Series A is when you start talking to venture capital firms. These are significant transactions. And to give you a little scope on these, an angel phase may be when you're raising a couple $100,000. You're getting started, this may be friends and family that you're raising some money from to get through that first step. While seed may go up to say $1 million to $1.5 million, $2 million. You'll see things published, $2 million seed round. Those kinds of companies are just barely starting to produce any revenue. Series A's, on the other hand, can range anywhere from $2 to $30 million these days. They're very substantial institutional money, and they're pretty much always, a post-revenue type business that has users and money and traction. Accelerators are a place you might deal with too. For example, in St. Louis, we have Capital Innovators. Accelerators provide funding and mentorship and basically a process where you can really get some exposure to people who can help you move and really accelerate your business. In the good old days, as in maybe 6 or 8 years ago, you could get into an accelerator sometimes when you were just barely starting to develop your MVP. That has become more and more of a challenge. It's almost impossible to get into a substantial accelerator these days unless you have a fairly developed product ready to launch. And so it's becoming much harder to raise money, you might say, very early on. At the same time, it's perceived that it's much easier to actually get into some kind of business early on.
Hey, David, is there any chance that you can use the presentation mode on your slides?
Yeah.
Or is that?
That's where I was having trouble sharing the screen here.
Oh, got it. Someone mentioned it was a little hard to see the text on it.
Let me stop the share. I'll try again. I have two screens going here, and that's where it. Here's where my challenge is. The share screen box is behind the full picture here now, and I have to figure out how to get it onto the other screen. What do you see? Real quick, I don't want to waste time with this.
We see your face.
You see my face. That's not good.
Can you go back to the showing the presentation and then hit the F5 button?
Now I have it. How's that?
It's perfect.
Great. The box came up on the right screen now. All right. Let's get back to where we were. Another pithy quote in here. Winston Churchill had some good advice for entrepreneurs. So the first thing really in this, a lot of the coaching and mentorship I do with companies when it gets into fundraising and pitching especially often gets back into breaking them back down to a fundamental, do you know what you are? What is the problem you're solving? One of the activities, one of the things that I participated very heavily in the last couple of years in St. Louis, we first had it at St. Louis Missouri Venture Forum and then moved it to I-10, is called the 2-minute forum or fast pitch. It's a 2-minute method of pitching. And what this really does is focus entrepreneurs on their business. And the interesting thing that comes out of it is it's not just a pitch. When you have to really break down your business into 2 minutes, you have to truly understand what you are and what you're doing. Otherwise, nobody's going to understand it. And if they don't understand it, you didn't explain it well, maybe you don't understand what your business is well enough either. That doesn't mean you don't know where you're trying to go, but it's breaking it down into the strategy. Problems are meant to be solved, and that's what we do with entrepreneurship. We solve problems. Very often, I'll see situations with people that have come up with something that sounds like a good idea, but it's a solution really looking for a problem. And those are just absolutely destined to fail. That doesn't mean there's not a good idea, they couldn't turn it around, but as long as they keep pursuing that pathway, that strategy, where they're really kind of a solution seeking a problem, they're not going to get anywhere. And one of my favorite places to look, I recommend this. It's about a 20-page white paper. It's available on the internet. It's just a PDF you can download. And that is What is Strategy by Michael Porter. He is the grandfather, you might say, of competitive strategy. He is a professor at Harvard. And having a good understanding, of strategy and competitive landscape and how you fit in it and how you can differentiate is really essential. And your best venture capitalists are going to ask for your understanding of the 5 forces someday. You need to understand your business model canvas, and a financial model. Financial model is more than just a simple pro forma. it really breaks down to how you think about this business and how you're going to scale it and what kind of money it's going to take over especially the first 2 to 3 years you grow. Which all breaks down into maybe the most important thing when it comes to funding is, what are you? Are you a growth venture or a revenue venture? Now, you may hear this term sometimes called lifestyle business. And as I noted there, I hate that term because professionals are in a lifestyle business. Family-held businesses are lifestyle businesses. They're great businesses. And in the venture world, lifestyle business is kind of used as a pejorative. When really, the thing to look at here is, are you growth or are you revenue? If you're starting from scratch, what is the economic outcome of your business? Most of the time, if you're on something like a call like this, if you're looking at building a venture, what you're looking at is a capital gain outcome. You're looking to build a company that somebody's going to buy in 5 to 10 years, or it's going to go public, and it's going to produce a big hit at the end. Of course, it'll pay salaries and things like that, but it's not going to be a revenue producer for as far as creating dividends or distributions to people. It is instead the economic outcome. The reason the investors are putting money in is they are hoping that 5 to 10, 7 to 10 years, if they're really thinking long term, that they are going to get a check. Your good venture investors understand that this is like baseball, that you're going to strike out 7 times out of 10, or at least get an out 7 times out of 10. And if you can bat 300, you're going to be in the Hall of Fame. That's success to people who understand venture investing. On the other hand, revenue investors are people who are seeking cash flow. Something that's been very popular entrepreneurship-wise in Missouri and other states in the last couple of years, for example, is the marijuana business. The marijuana business, people are approaching it too often like it's a venture capital type business, and they're looking for investors and they're pitching these things like that, when really it's more like an operating business that's going to produce cash flow very rapidly. And the investors aren't looking necessarily to sell this, they're looking for long-term cash flow. A more sophisticated version is if they were buying rental properties. Capital gains are important, but they're secondary. And they expect these companies to produce cash flow. And this is really important because it goes into your story. It goes into also whether you have a real potential to raise money. In the end, also know what you are. Is the founder the CEO, and what's that CEO's job? If you are a founder of a business, you can't do everything. Your job is to maximize shareholder value. And the way you do that is you create a team, and you lead that team to a strategy. And knowing what you are means bringing the right people into that team to help you grow it. So once you know what you are, you need to, of course, set that up correctly. People jump to this a lot of times when I have conversations with them. If they want to know, should I be a corporation, LLC? That's not the number one issue. The number one issue is really to understand what your business is. If you're going down a venture capital path, a lot of times law firms and accountants will want to put companies in limited liability companies, but frankly, you should just go straight to a C corporation from day one, because that is what the investors are going to want. And it'll save you more money in the long run, because I can tell you, setting up a limited liability company, from the documentation, if you have multiple members, can be pretty expensive, and you'll just have to convert it to a C corp someday down the road. That can have tax costs, and it can also create issues when you're changing different parameters for different people. So the question then is, setting up correctly, is this is when you should decide who's really part of this team in the sense of owners. Who are the real founders? Is it the person who really brought the idea? Is it the next couple of people who put in some involvement? If you get a group of people together to start a business and you have too many on that cap table, and some of them aren't doing anything, that's what I call by zombies, you can really make yourself look unattractive to investors. Investors want to know that there is a solid core group of people who are going to be committed to building this company through the long haul. And by long haul, at least the next 3 to 5 years. That means that's usually not more than 2 to 4 people that are truly going to be the founders setting up a business and owning any kind of interest in it from day one. So that begs the question, well, how do I get somebody to do a little work for me? Do I give them a percent, to help do some technical work? That goes into cluttering things up. You've got to be really wise about putting people on your cap table at very low percentages in trying to build a business. I know that can get in the way of, well, you don't always have the money to do it, but you have to be very careful with that and make sure that it's documented in a way and established in a way that those people aren't going to be problematic later when investors start coming in. Just kind of a side point, why Delaware? Delaware is really one of those things that you've got to address because it makes it's not, again, it's one of those things, you don't win the war because you're in Delaware. You might lose the war because you're not. Delaware, 200 years ago, decided, hey, we're a tiny state. We've got to have business. So let's go into the business of business. And they created a corporate structure and corporate statutes that are really designed to be management and business favorable. And as a result, almost every major corporation in the United States is incorporated in Delaware. When you incorporate in Delaware, you can take your fundraising papers and your documents to any potential investor in the United States, and they're not going to raise an eyebrow or ask questions about it because they and their attorney understand Delaware corporate law. While if you're going around with Missouri or Illinois statutes, they might say, well, I don't know Missouri or Illinois. Again, that gets in the way. You want to eliminate things that could get in the way. Now, to save money, very often, the first steps, I'll set up people in Missouri, and then we'll switch to Delaware when they start fundraising. That's not, it doesn't add too much to, too much expense over time. It allows them to do it cheap on day one. But before we're going out to fundraise with other people, typically we're switching to Delaware because you want something that's universally accepted. Third piece that I see people, really kind of fail with is they don't have a compelling story. I went recently to an I-Corps session, which is a program I completely recommend. It's put on by a couple of guys connected with St. Louis University. It's a national program, but it really helps you go through your business. And it's fascinating how many times I hear, and I don't mean to be too harsh here, but people are trying too much to save the world. You save the world one little bite at a time, you might say. You've got to have a compelling, identifiable problem. And then you add on to it. Oh, and by the way, we're mission driven because this helps the greater good. An example, there's a St. Louis company. I'm gonna talk about them. They went through the 2-minute pitch a couple of years ago, Via Sarah. Via Sarah started with us when going through the 2-minute pitch with really, we're going to help save lots of lives. Well, that sounds really great, but it's like, tell me how. You got to catch my attention very quickly. By the time it was done, it was just immediately impactful. When the opening statement in the pitch was 40,000 people needlessly die every year from infections in hospitals, and we have a solution. That immediately turned into a compelling story. It was something you could identify. It was directly impactful. It had sense. It made sense. And they had traction. They already had product. They already had drug tests. They could demonstrate that they had actually had success with a group of patients. They brought it down to something identifiable and that they were directly solving one problem. And that's really crucial because, your investors want to be able to see cause and effect. If I put money into you, how am I going to make money out? kind of second, this seems like it's a no-brainer, but you've got to have a good presentation and a good pitch deck. And that's probably even more important now. Graphic designers are available on Upwork, very cheap. You can use programs online like SlideBean. You may not think of yourself in the marketing business. You're in the marketing business because you want to convey to your investors that you absolutely can sell what you are creating. And if your pitch deck doesn't reflect that, if it is too technocratic, if it is not directly saying exactly what you're going to do in a clear manner that anyone can read from and understand that they need to go deeper on the second slide, you're going to lose people. I'll go back to Tyler and I were having a conversation a few years ago about pitch decks. And we kind of came to the conclusion that if you send a pitch deck to an investor and they're probably going to bring it up on the email on their phone. And if they can't read it and understand they need to go home and bring this up on a big screen or print it out by the second slide, you've lost them. You've got to be able to create a compelling story that immediately hits with people. The last thing I say there could have the first. Do you have traction? If you have traction, it probably goes first. What I have in the chevrons at the bottom is your typical pitch deck, basically. Problem, solution, product, will it make money, how will it grow, why you, why now? If you have traction, if you have sales and users, that should probably go in the first one. We have a new product that already has 10,000 users, and here's the problem we're solving. Why? Because if you're already doing something, that's going to catch the attention of your investors. Apologize here, there we go. Who should you get money from? Well, you've probably heard the phrase friends, family, and fools for your first round. And I think it's, you can see the caption, the title here, friends, family, fools, and hometown. Sometimes people get too stuck into people they know and staying home. Who invests can affect your future. From a standpoint of let's not screw this up for the future, friends and family can be a problem, even though it may be what you have to resort to get the first dollars you need. Friends and family, for one, it's the relationships. If things don't go well, I can guarantee you holiday dinners are not going to be pleasant. It's hard to find the believers. That's really what you need early on. You need believers. And it's probably going to be 3 people out of 100 at best that you beat. You need to expand beyond the friends and family, because friends and family also, unless you're from a family that's got some affluence, they probably aren't accredited investors. Accredited investor is a term, it's a definition under the Securities and Exchange Commission Acts. An accredited investor is somebody that makes at least $200,000 a year or has $1 million of net worth without their home. In other words, they're considered by law to be sophisticated enough to take risk on investing on things like on speculative ventures. If you don't, I've seen many angel investors who will not invest if there are non-accredited investors on the cap table. People who aren't accredited investors, should be avoided for a couple of reasons. One, the regulations that govern fundraising, the exemptions that allow you to go out and do these private placements without a lot of disclosure or registration with the Securities and Exchange Commission. In other words, just to take a safe or a convertible note around to people, require that you're only soliciting accredited investors. And if you want to solicit non-accredited investors, you have to fit under different exemptions. And those can be very difficult to meet. And I can talk about those in detail with any of you if you want to offline. So you complicate things legally when you don't deal exclusively with accredited investors. And as I said, other accredited investors sometimes won't invest when they see non-accredited. And the other reason is because non-accredited investors, because they're probably not sophisticated and they're not experienced, can be a real pain in the butt. They'll not just to you, but to the other investors. They're more likely to bring a lawsuit. They're more likely to hound you all the time for where's my money or why am I not making anything? And it's partly because they don't understand what they invested in. Next step is really, and I think this is really relevant in St. Louis. Are they seeking revenue or capital gains? Now, they may think they're a venture investor sometimes, but what they really have in their mindset is a revenue mentality. In other words, they're thinking that there should be a 3 to 5 year exit and profits very soon. I said this phrase for several years now, and I've bumped into other people in the Midwest and St. Louis and Chicago and Kansas City who were basically repeating back to me my quote that they came up with independently, and that is, all too often investors in the Midwest they want venture capital returns but private equity risk. Now, what's that mean? It means that they want that 10x return, but they want to see it in 3 to 5 years with some revenue. Part of that is because a lot of the money in the Midwest was made through more traditional brick and mortar manufacturing type businesses. And so they didn't make it through the risk like they did in Silicon Valley. They don't understand and appreciate it quite the same way. That's changing a little more, but it can still be a challenge. The next part is, which maybe is a good segue into, get out of your hometown. A person I recommend reading their blog is Paul Singh. Paul used to come to St. Louis and travel around the country in his custom Airstream trailer behind his custom Raptor pickup. And he was visiting tech towns around the country. And one of his rules is start 500 miles away from your hometown and then work back in. There's the old line that nobody's a prophet in their hometown. Nobody's a big deal in their hometown. Besides, you're not going to make it if you're only a local company. You should be looking nationally or regionally for money. You may be in a business where there's not a lot of people who understand your business. If you're in fintech and you're not in a town that has a lot of people who understand financial technology, you need to go where those investors are. That doesn't mean they're going to make you move. You may be in a town that's great to have that business, there just aren't investors there yet. And finally, your hometown may not be market competitive. If it has that kind of private equity risk and venture capital return mentality, the terms you get. I mean, a dirty little secret I tell clients all the time is, if you want to get good terms in St. Louis, you go out of town to get terms first and then bring it back here. And it's something I've observed multiple times, that investors here will gladly follow along to more favorable terms set by investors elsewhere. But if you go to the ones here first, you're going to get stuff that you would never accept unless you were desperate. So I don't mean to denigrate St. Louis. I think we have a great startup community here, but you have to really understand where the money's coming from and how it prices out nationally. So be careful who you include. Family can be a problem on the cap table, and go out of town. Find smart money. Another little bit of wisdom: entrepreneurs average 3.8 failures before final success. Don't give up. I guess I'm wise because I've had a lot of failure. Last point before a couple: be a hungry Buddha, which is kind of what do I mean by this? You have to move forward, but you need a strategy and you need to be calm and kind of stick with it. What I see a lot of times with people trying to raise money is they're all over the place, trying to cut any deal they can to get somebody's check. And I guarantee you will have people say, well, you just do it. You do what you need to do to get the money. But when you do that, you're also potentially buying problems. If you're not finding that middle path between desperate and greedy, you'll end up making deals just all over the place and you won't be consistent. And as a result, if you're negotiating a different deal with every investor and it all looks different, you do come out looking desperate, like you don't have a strategy. And as you accrue investors, they're going to be irritated if they did not get similar deals for similar money. Pardon me. So what do you want to do? You want to start out and really understand your market. What's the appropriate valuation for a company like yours? What's the appropriate discounts that would go into a convertible note or a safe, for example? I often have clients, we put together a term sheet, we leave a giant draft header on it, and they take it to 3 or 4 or 5 of their best relationships that would actually be candid and for potential investors, and they float them by them to see if they're in the right ballpark. And if we're getting good feedback, that draft header comes off and then it goes back out to the people who they could invest with. The key here is you want to set those terms up front and have that strategy. You don't ever want to go backwards. If you start out with your company saying a $5 million valuation cap and you get investors, you don't lower it to $3 million later for another investor because you want their money. That really is not a good look. That doesn't mean you can't come up with arrangements that favor certain investors. There's this thing we often do called a side letter. You want to keep your investments the same with everybody, but if somebody wants to write you a $250,000 check, you find a way to accommodate them without really breaking the big picture investment pattern. So maybe you give them other rights. Maybe they get to sit in on your board meetings. Maybe they get more information rights. Maybe they get the right to be able to make follow-on investments at the same terms as the venture capital people. But you can do that and give them an extra sweetener to what they're putting in without making their investment stand out from all the other people you've already taken money from. So be consistent. You want to find that middle path. That's why it's kind of that calm Buddha. And not be reacting to every potential place you can get, you think you need to go to get money. So that's really some of the major tips. And I really came up with those because these are the mistakes I see people make. They don't have it, like I said, they have people on the cap table that shouldn't be there. They've taken money from family or non-accredited investors, and it's actually getting in the way for the next round of investment. They don't have a good story. They haven't figured out what they are. They've got a corporate structure that has to be cleaned up dramatically versus it would have cost them a lot less and been a lot less of a hassle to have it clean from the beginning. Which leads to, maybe some of the things people typically ask. So how should I raise money? If you're at that early stage, you will find people, I've got a couple of friends around town that are very influential that love to do equity. They hate convertible instruments. But frankly, it's very hard to value a startup. Your most likely instrument that you're going to be using with investors is a safe or a convertible note. And I really didn't set up to talk about that today because these are much more the mechanics. They don't so much as screw you up, except it's more a matter of this is now how you implement once you have the other things in place. Convertibles and safes are a great idea for a scalable business, but if you're something that's more of a revenue strategy, they can be a terrible idea because you're probably not going to have a venture capital firm come in later to actually set the value for your business. I talked a little bit about side letters, so I'm going to kind of close here with a little bit of equity crowdfunding. I kind of left that off. And it's one where equity crowdfunding can be a problem with raising other money, but people are starting to accept it. What my observation is with equity crowdfunding these days is it's a solution that was looking for a problem. it was based on this concept that there's all kinds of people out there that want to put $500 into startups and make money and become Bill Gates and, you know, Stephen Jobs and like a, you know, Mark Andreessen and people like that. It's not really the case. There are people who want to invest, but it's just not like what was perceived. There's not this great mass of money that's really wanting to unleash and invest in startups. The flip side is I've heard many people say, well, if you can't get your business funded through angels, try equity crowdfunding. Well, let's think about that. If your business isn't good enough for people who really understand it to invest in it, do you really think that taking it to the masses is necessarily going to create a solution for that? There are exceptions. Sometimes the experts are out of touch with what the general audience wants. And so I think you have to look at your business and say, why am I not raising money? Is for crowdfunding, you know, equity crowdfunding a good thing to do? You have to look at that business. And if your market surveys are showing that there's a real disconnect, then it might make some sense. But if it's more because people just aren't buying what you're selling, equity crowdfunding is not going to solve that. Now, I'm talking about equity crowdfunding in this case too, as opposed to, for example, things like Kickstarter, where you're selling a product. Those are great ways, I think, to really get something launched. John Wooden, things work out best for those who make the best of how things work out. I'm glad to stay on here for questions. Here's some resources I suggest you use. I didn't really hit on this like I should have. Crunchbase, CB Insights, and PitchBook are 3 sources. They're subscription sources, but they're affordable for entrepreneurs that have databases of almost every venture capital deal that takes place in the United States, and to some degree internationally if you want to go there. These are valuable, so you can download lists of investors that invest certain amounts in the types of industry you're in. A great way to look and beyond where you are is you've got to play the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation. Figure out who you know in your LinkedIn database, for example, and then start playing connections to potential investors and find out, hey, wait, I'm 2 steps away from this guy who's put 10 investments into deals just similar to mine. They like this, they have an appetite for it. This is where the work comes in. You have to find those connections to the potential people that have the money, and you actually can reverse engineer some of those. Second thing I recommend anybody do is Techstars runs 2 to 3 times a year an online course called Venture Deals. It's based on the Venture Deals book done by Brad Feld and I forget his co-author's name, I apologize. It is an incredible course to understand the venture capital and financing process. It is really designed to help you have an understanding of what your attorneys and your accountants are talking about, what venture capitalists and investors look for, and to work through it. And it's also, because you work a lot in teams, it's a great way to meet people around the country and have some really good discussions. Along the Brad Feld thing and another one, Fortune Term Sheet, number 3 and 4 are things I recommend you sign up for and occasionally read, because they'll give you ideas of what's going on in the investment world and real practical information of what types of things are being funded and at what kinds of terms. Number 5 is SlideBeam. I don't necessarily recommend them. I haven't used their service to have them construct slides, but they are a graphic designer using AI to put together pitch decks. What I do like about them that won't cost you a penny is they have a remarkable set of slide templates, ranging from sales to Series A to seed funding, that really is a nice resource when you're looking for, how do I build my pitch deck? They also have a wonderful YouTube channel that has 10 to 15-minute presentations on some excellent topics for entrepreneurship and getting funded that will just take some of the things I talked about here and take them even a little bit further. Founder Suite is another site, kind of like Crunchbase, CB Insights, PitchBook. I use it occasionally. it is a pay-for service. You don't necessarily have to pay for it, but it's kind of a CRM and a database for investors, and it may be a tool you might find useful. iCore I mentioned, that's through St. Louis U. If you are at whether you're early stage or you're kind of refining it, definitely go through the iCore process. It's a great way to guide your client discovery and develop your strategy. It's a couple of the best Saturday mornings you'll spend. And finally, if you're anything close to tech, join i10. We have numerous mentors, lots of programs. Right now is a little bit of a challenge, but there's a lot of people who are doing mentorship by video and by phone and other ways. So it's one of the best resources in St. Louis and in the Midwest when it comes to a real process of entrepreneurship. And the Mock Angel program is designed to help guide you through this, to be ready for raising money. I've served as a Mock Angel. We sit and listen to the pitches, we give them feedback, and we prepare people after a couple of experiments, you might say, after a couple of demonstrations they do for us, to really go forward and try and to raise money. So I'm going to stop the share